A man of pride and ruin is forced into a marriage he never wanted, and a woman of quiet grace carries a secret that could change everything. In a world ruled by appearances and whispered judgment, one cold wedding night will ignite a story of betrayal, redemption, and unexpected love. When Julian Barrett was compelled to wed the wealthy widow, Hattie Prescott, he believed he was surrendering his freedom. But what he didn't know was that his heart was about to find its truest home. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And do you believe that love born from duty can become love that lasts forever? Boston, Massachusetts. Autumn of the year 1880. The air was heavy with the scent of withering leaves and fading privilege as Julian Barrett crossed the iron gates of Greystone Hall, his family's once proud estate now veiled in neglect. The gravel of the driveway cracked beneath his boots, echoing across the barren grounds, like a memory too loud to ignore. Ivy crept like silent accusation across the stone facade, and the windows, once gleaming with pride, now blinked wearily beneath layers of soot and time. Julian removed his gloves with precision, his jaw tight, his gaze lifted not toward the grandeur that once defined his name, but toward the man awaiting him on the marble steps, Thaddeus Loring, his stepfather, ever dignified in appearance, ever hollow in soul. The older man's silver-tipped cane tapped against the stone with calculated rhythm, his eyes as cold as the marble lions flanking the entrance. "You're late," Thaddeus said without affection, his voice clipped, perfumed with condescension. "I came as quickly as I could," Julian replied, brushing dust from his coat, "though I wonder if what remains here warrants urgency." They did not embrace. They never did. Inside, the parlor retained the shape of former glory. Velvet drapes, French mirrors dulled with age, and a fireplace that had not known warmth in years. Thaddeus stood by the mantel, swirling a brandy he had not earned, while Julian remained standing, his silhouette framed by the pale light of the window. "You've squandered every opportunity I handed you," Thaddeus began, voice like the snap of dry wood. "I've kept this family afloat longer than you deserved. Now, you'll do your part." Julian did not flinch. "And what is that part?" Thaddeus turned slowly. "You'll marry Hattie Prescott, a widow, substantial fortune, no heirs, uncomplicated." The name struck Julian like a cold draught. He had heard it whispered in gentlemen's clubs and around poker tables. A woman with silver in her veins, no beauty to speak of, and a fortune built on her dead husband's sweat. "A tycoon's relic," Julian murmured, bitterness curling his lips. "You would sell me to a widow." "I would save your name," Thaddeus corrected with venomous calm. "If you won't do it for me, do it for your mother's memory. She wouldn't have wanted the Barrett name to fall into dust." At that, Julian turned away, jaw clenched. The mention of his mother, Lydia, gentle and elegant, was a calculated blow. That evening, in a modest parlor on the other side of Boston, Hattie Prescott stood near her window, watching the gas lamps flicker to life beyond the lace curtains. Her hands, though graceful, trembled as she unfolded the letter delivered by a solicitor. A marriage proposal. No words of tenderness, no request. Only terms, conditions. She was 34, and society had long decided her fate. Too quiet, too plain, too proper. Her husband, the late Edgar Prescott, had left her with wealth and silence. And now an opportunity had arrived, not for love, but for a name. And perhaps something more. Something she would not name aloud. She pressed the letter to her chest. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine that someone, somewhere, saw her differently. Then she folded it again, placed it inside her drawer, and whispered to the shadows, "Yes." The wedding, held 3 weeks later, was a cold procession of duty. No music lingered, no flowers perfumed the air, just the soft rustle of silk and the sharper rustle of judgment. The Barrett name still carried enough weight to fill the pews, and Hattie's wealth enough to justify the scandal. She wore a dove-grey gown trimmed in jet beads, her dark chestnut hair pinned in a modest chignon. Julian stood beside her in a black frock coat, expression unreadable, hands gloved and stiff. Their vows were exchanged without emotion, without tenderness. The officiant barely raised his voice above the tension in the room. Behind lace fans, the whispers swirled like ash. The plain widow, the disgraced golden boy. She's bought herself a Barrett. He's sold himself to survive. That evening, the house on Beacon Hill welcomed its new master with silent walls and too many closed doors. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Servants moved like shadows, eyes lowered. Julian entered the master bedroom only to deposit his cane and gloves. He did not undress. He did not speak. Hattie stood by the fire in a soft evening robe of mauve silk, her gaze steady, though her hands twisted the hem of her sleeve. "You may have the larger suite," she said gently. "It's yours now." Julian nodded once. "I'll take the smaller room." She took a breath, then crossed the room to a writing desk. From it, she retrieved a bundle wrapped in pale ribbon, old letters, carefully preserved. She held them out to him, the candlelight catching the satin bow. "A gift," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "from before." Julian glanced at the bundle but did not reach for it. His eyes, cold with exhaustion and pride, lingered on her face for a beat too long. Then, without a word, he turned and left the room. Hattie remained there, alone beside the fire, the bundle still in her hand. Slowly, she placed it on the table. Then she sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and closed her eyes. Outside, the city slept under gaslight and frost, unaware that a marriage had begun, not in love nor in joy, but in silence. A silence filled with shadows, with secrets, and the quiet hope that even the most bitter beginnings might one day soften. Boston, Massachusetts. Late autumn of the year 1880, a thin veil of morning fog curled through the narrow streets of Beacon Hill as the carriage came to a halt before the Prescott townhouse. Its facade, of pale limestone trimmed with black shutters, reflected a quiet dignity that did not boast but endured. The windows, framed in lace, caught the wan light of dawn as if holding it captive, refusing to let it enter. When Julian Barrett stepped down from the carriage, cane in hand, the cold bit at his cheeks, and the city's distant bells announced an hour too early for comfort and too late for retreat. The house stood like its mistress, restrained, graceful, and impossible to read. Inside, the faint aroma of tea leaves and furniture polish lingered. A clock ticked softly in the hallway, marking time with the same measured patience that Hattie Prescott herself embodied. The servants, gathered discreetly near the entrance, offered the kind of courtesy that held more caution than welcome. Mrs. Mabel Higgins, the housekeeper, curtsied with a stiff politeness. Her eyes, bright and shrewd beneath their age, studied Julian from head to toe. Behind her, the maid, Clara, fumbled nervously with her apron strings, while the butler, Mr. Denning, kept his chin high, his expression guarded. "Mr. Barrett," Mrs. Higgins greeted him, her tone edged with formality. "Mrs. Barrett awaits you in the morning room." Julian's brow tightened at the title. Mrs. Barrett, a name that did not belong to her, and yet did. He nodded curtly and handed his gloves to Denning, who accepted them with a glance that bordered on defiance. The corridor was lined with paintings, seascapes, portraits, and muted still lifes that whispered of restraint. Everything about the house was precise, immaculately tended, yet suffocating in its order. The kind of beauty one admired without ever feeling at home. When he entered the morning room, Hattie rose from her chair, dressed in a lavender day gown trimmed with delicate ivory lace. Her posture was composed, her face calm, though her eyes flickered briefly with apprehension. The sunlight filtering through the lace curtains softened her features, and for a fleeting moment Julian noticed that her plainness was not absence of beauty, but rather the quiet kind one learned too late to value. "You must be tired," she said gently, folding her hands before her. "The journey from Greystone is long." "I've had longer," he replied, removing his hat with deliberate formality. "Your home is comfortable. It is yours as well now," she answered, her voice composed but low. "You'll find your study prepared and the master's suite ready. I took the liberty of keeping the adjoining library as it was. My late husband spent most of his time there." He detected the tremor behind the politeness, the way her words sought a bridge while his built walls. "That won't be necessary," he said, glancing briefly around. "I require little." She hesitated, then nodded. "Very well." Their eyes met, his sharp and weary, hers calm and searching. The silence between them felt alive, heavy with what neither dared to say. When Mrs. Higgins entered moments later to ask about breakfast, both turned away at once, grateful for the interruption. The morning passed in ceremonial civility. Julian explored the townhouse, noting how its elegance bore no ostentation. The drawing room was arranged in soft shades of cream and grey, with a piano covered by lace and a vase of withered lilies on the mantel. The dining room gleamed with polished silver, and the study smelled faintly of ink and memory. Every object spoke of Hattie's meticulous nature, everything in its place, even her solitude. At luncheon, they sat opposite each other at the long mahogany table. Between them stood crystal and china, gleaming like barriers. Conversation was scarce, confined to remarks about the weather and the servants' reliability. Hattie's tone remained even, but her gaze often drifted toward the window, as if her thoughts lived beyond the house's walls. Julian, who had spent his youth surrounded by noise, power, and indulgence, found her silence unnerving. He mistook it for indifference, not realizing that her restraint was the armor of a woman long judged by the cruelty of whispers. After the meal, he retreated to the study assigned to him. A fire burned low in the grate, casting amber light over the bookshelves. He ran a finger along the spines of the volumes, poetry, moral essays, and treatises on commerce. Nothing frivolous, nothing easy. The widow had read not to dream, but to endure. On the desk lay a small glass vase with a single white rose. Its petals trembled faintly in the draught, as if it too held its breath. Julian sat down, exhaled, and allowed himself to remove his cravat. He was a man trapped between gratitude and resentment, between necessity and pride. Hattie's fortune had saved him, yet it chained him to a life he had not chosen. He thought of his stepfather's words. "She's plain but wealthy, uncomplicated," and yet nothing about her felt simple. As twilight settled, Hattie moved quietly through the corridors, ensuring everything in the household ran smoothly. Her steps were light, her presence calm. She paused by the door of the study, hearing the faint scratch of a pen. He was writing. She wondered what he wrote about, a letter to a friend, perhaps, or to the stepfather whose shadow still hung between them. She turned away before curiosity could betray her composure. Later, in her private sitting room, Hattie sat before a small writing desk of rosewood. The candlelight flickered against her face, revealing weariness she never displayed by day. She took out an old photograph, herself beside her late husband, Edgar Prescott, a man older by 2 decades, stern and indifferent even in stillness. She traced the edge of the image with a finger and whispered, "You gave me a name, not a life." Her thoughts drifted to the years after his death, how society had courted her fortune, but not her friendship, how invitations arrived out of obligation, and how women whispered behind their gloves. A widow with no children, no beauty, no laughter. And yet, in those lonely years, one friendship had warmed her heart. Lydia Barrett, Julian's mother. Lydia had been kind, gentle, and daringly honest. She had spoken to Hattie as an equal, not as an ornament of fortune, until the day she vanished from her life without explanation, leaving only silence in her wake. Hattie's throat tightened at the memory. She had never known why Lydia had withdrawn, but her letters, those same letters now tied with ribbon, remained her only link to a time when she had felt seen. Night came slowly. The streets outside glowed beneath the flicker of gas lamps, and the rumble of distant carriages filled the air. Upstairs, Julian sat by his window, still fully dressed, the fire burning low. The house was too quiet. He could hear the faint sound of footsteps, hers, he assumed, crossing the hallway, the rustle of her gown brushing the doorframe. The sound stirred something he could not name. He rose, restless, and his eyes fell upon the bundle of letters she had left untouched on the table the night of their wedding. They rested exactly where he had placed them, the satin bow catching the firelight like a silent invitation. For reasons he did not understand, he reached for them. The paper was aged but cared for, the handwriting on the outermost envelope elegant and familiar. He sat down, his pulse quickening as he broke the seal. The first line stole the breath from his chest. "My dearest Hattie, forgive the cowardice of my silence." He froze. The handwriting, the voice beneath the ink, unmistakable. His mother, Lydia Barrett. The letters trembled in his grasp as he read on, the words carrying a tenderness that belonged to a world long gone. "I fear my silence has wounded you more than my words ever could. Thaddeus has convinced me that your friendship is a danger to us both. But he lies, Hattie. He fears what he cannot control." Julian's vision blurred. The fire cracked, the shadows danced. His mother's name, once sacred, now felt poisoned by betrayal. The truth, hidden in ink, bled into the room like light breaking through stained glass. He leaned back, closing his eyes. For the first time, he felt the tremor of something deeper than resentment, shame, confusion, and the faintest flicker of understanding. Down the hall, unaware that her past had just been resurrected, Hattie extinguished her candle and whispered a prayer into the darkness, asking only for peace. But peace, in that house on Beacon Hill, had never been more fragile. The dawn in Boston arrived dressed in silence, and the golden light that crept through the curtains of the Prescott townhouse seemed softer that morning, as if reluctant to disturb what had quietly shifted in the dark. Julian Barrett sat alone in the study, the bundle of letters now open before him, their delicate pages spread across the desk like fallen petals. The candle had burned low through the night, casting flickering shadows against the leather-bound books and the glass decanter on the sideboard. His cravat lay forgotten on the arm of the chair, his coat abandoned hours earlier. His eyes, red-rimmed and sleepless, scanned the final lines of a letter dated 8 years prior. "You must understand, Hattie. He is not what he pretends to be. I thought him ambitious, but now I see the ambition rots him from within. I fear what will happen if I defy him, but I fear more what I've allowed him to do in my name." His mother's words sank into Julian like shards of glass. With every page, the woman he had admired as the gentle center of his childhood emerged more vulnerable, more human, and more complicit in the quiet destruction of a kind woman she had once called her dearest friend. Julian leaned back in the chair, closing his eyes. The fire had died to embers, but the heat remained on his skin. Shame, guilt, disbelief, they twisted within him like smoke in a locked room. For so long he had believed Hattie Prescott was nothing more than a convenient solution, a woman of wealth and little charm who had purchased her place in his life with coin and silence. Now the truth bled across the parchment in the neat hand of the mother who had once kissed his forehead and told him never to lie. And she had lied, or rather allowed a lie to bloom and poison what it touched. A dull knock at the door stirred him. "Sir," came Denning's voice through the wood, "breakfast is served." Julian stood slowly, his body heavy with the weight of knowledge. He gathered the letters carefully, retied the ribbon with fingers that trembled, and placed them in the drawer of his desk, locking them without knowing why. As he left the study, he felt as though the house had changed shape overnight, as though the walls now listened and judged. Downstairs, the dining room awaited. The long table gleamed beneath the morning sun, and the porcelain gleamed in elegant silence. Hattie was already seated, her posture as composed as ever, dressed in a soft periwinkle morning gown with a high collar trimmed in cream lace. Her hair, parted and coiled at her nape, revealed the delicate curve of her neck. "Good morning," she said, her voice quiet but not timid. Julian paused, caught by the unfamiliar weight of her presence. For the first time, he truly looked at her, not the shape of her, not the sum of societal judgments, but her, the calm dignity in her gaze, the way her hands folded, always still, the sadness that lingered in the corners of her mouth, like a story unfinished. "Good morning," he replied, slower than usual. He took his seat. Silence stretched between them, but it was not the silence of resentment. It was something newer, something undefined. Across the table, a silver teapot steamed. Clara entered and poured their cups with practiced hands, her eyes darting curiously between the two. "You slept well, I hope?" Hattie asked gently. "I read," he answered truthfully, then added, "late into the night." She nodded, her lashes lowering as she stirred her tea. For a long moment he considered asking her, about the letters, about his mother, about the wound that had been allowed to fester between them for nearly a decade. But he did not. Not yet. He didn't know how to unearth the truth without reopening the pain. Instead, he said, "I noticed the painting in the library, the seascape." Her gaze lifted. "My father painted it. He was a quiet man, but he loved to sail. He said the sea was the only place a man could be truly honest." Julian's lips curved, not into a smile, but something close. He must have found it a lonely place then. Her expression softened. Not quite amusement, but recognition. Perhaps that's why he painted it so often. He didn't know how else to hold it. Julian nodded, and silence returned. But it was no longer cold. It breathed between them, a fragile thread woven from mutual awareness. Later that morning, Hattie walked through the garden alone, the hem of her gown brushing the frost-kissed gravel. The hedges were trimmed, the rose bushes dormant. Autumn had pulled its cloak tightly around the earth. She paused beneath the arbor where vines once bloomed, her fingers grazing the ironwork. She had felt it at breakfast, the shift. Julian's eyes no longer held contempt, but inquiry. He had looked at her as a man looks at a stranger he might one day understand, and that, more than anything, unsettled her. For years, she had trained herself to live beneath the gaze of others, to let their judgments pass like wind against glass. But now he was seeing her. It would be dangerous to hope. Inside, Julian paced the length of his study. He could not forget the letters, the tone of his mother's voice, the guilt that curled through her words. Nor could he forget the grace with which Hattie carried the scars that had been inflicted by the very people he once called his world. She had loved his mother, that much was clear, and his mother had loved her in return until fear had severed that bond. Thaddeus Loring's shadow stretched long, and it had shaped the lives of both women. And his. Julian approached the fireplace and stared into the cold hearth. He had always prided himself on clarity, on seeing the world as it was. But now the truths he once held dear felt like smoke, slipping through his fingers. That evening, he entered the drawing room just as Hattie was setting aside her embroidery. The light from the chandelier bathed her in warmth, and for a moment he paused in the doorway, uncertain. She looked up, surprised. "Did you need something?" "No," he said, then corrected himself. "I thought I might read." She gestured toward the chaise. "You're welcome to." He sat, not too close, and opened a book without noting the title. The minutes passed in silence, broken only by the occasional crackle from the hearth and the soft rustle of thread through linen. When he finally looked at her, he saw not a wife he had never wanted, but a woman who had borne injustice with quiet valor. A woman who had once been his mother's confidant, a woman who had stood alone in the face of ruin and never bowed. He cleared his throat. "You knew her well, didn't you?" Hattie's fingers stilled. "I did," she said after a pause, "but not as well as I thought." Their eyes met, and the unspoken trembled in the space between them. Julian looked down at his book again, but he no longer saw the words. And Hattie, with her needle paused mid-air, let out a slow breath, not of fear nor of pain, but of something long forgotten, possibility. The week unfolded with the slow hush of late autumn, and Boston's elite buzzed in hushed tones over the upcoming masquerade, hosted by the Huntington family, one of the oldest names on the eastern seaboard. Their annual ball was an affair of reputation, rumor, and exquisite excess, where fortunes were whispered about behind velvet fans and alliances were struck beneath the sweep of chandeliers. The invitation arrived at the Prescott townhouse, folded in thick ivory parchment, sealed in gold wax, bearing both their names, Mr. and Mrs. Julian Barrett. Hattie read the envelope at her writing desk, her fingers cool against the creamy paper. The script was elegant, the message brief. She stared at it for a long moment, lips parted, before standing and quietly leaving the room. She found Julian in the study, half buried in ledgers, the fire crackling low. "We've been invited," she said without ceremony, holding out the card. He took it and read silently. Then, folding it once, he met her gaze. "We should go." Her brow lifted faintly. "Should we?" "The Huntingtons wouldn't invite you if you weren't being watched," he said, his voice measured. "They want to see who you are. Let them." "I know who I am," she replied, calm but guarded. He rose from the chair. "Yes, but they don't. Not truly. They only see what's been whispered." The words hung between them. Hattie understood their weight. In those rooms of silk and smoke, where names were knives and beauty was currency, she would be measured, weighed, and likely dismissed. Still, she gave a quiet nod. "Very well. I'll go." In the following days, the house stirred with quiet preparations. Clara assisted in retrieving Hattie's rarely used trunk of formal gowns, some still wrapped in tissue. None seemed suitable. Too somber, too aged, too bound by mourning. It was Mrs. Higgins who remembered the lilac satin. "It was never worn, madam," she murmured, lifting the delicate fabric from its resting place in the cedar chest. "You had it made the spring before your husband fell ill." Hattie touched the gown with reverence. Lilac, the colour of a widow re-emerging, neither joyful nor grieving. It shimmered softly in the light, embroidered with tiny violets across the bodice and hem, as if memory had bloomed in secret upon the fabric. The day of the ball arrived cloaked in mist. Gas lamps glowed early along the cobbled streets, and carriages echoed like distant thunder. Inside the dressing room, Hattie sat before her mirror in silence, while Clara arranged her hair in a low twist, leaving a few curls to soften her temples. Powder dusted her cheeks, and a touch of plum coloured her lips. She wore a pearl mask, delicate and gleaming, framing her features with ethereal lightness. When she descended the stairs, the hush that followed was not just surprise, it was awe. Julian stood near the foyer, in a tailored black evening coat and white waistcoat, a gold-accented mask in hand. He turned, ready to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The woman before him, graceful, poised, luminous, bore only a passing resemblance to the quiet figure who had served him tea each morning. The lilac satin clung to her form with understated elegance, the embroidery catching the gaslight with every movement. Her neck was bare, but for a single strand of pearls, and her gloved hands rested lightly at her waist. "You, look," he began, then faltered. She tilted her head. "Presentable." He stepped forward. "Unrecognizable." Her breath caught, not at the compliment, but at the note in his voice. Wonder edged with remorse. They said nothing more as they entered the carriage. The ride to the Huntington estate was quiet, broken only by the sound of hooves and the faint rattle of glass. Julian watched her from the corner of his eye, unsure of how to speak the storm within him. Desire, yes, but also shame, for how he had dismissed her, ignored her, judged her. Now, confronted with the truth of her beauty, he realized that her appeal had never been in her appearance, but in the dignity with which she carried her pain. The ballroom blazed with light. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings painted with mythological scenes, and a full orchestra played beneath garlands of white roses and ivy. Guests shimmered in silks and jewels, masks of gold, silver and velvet obscuring identities only until the hour made them irrelevant. They entered beneath a carved archway, and for a moment the room stilled. The lilac widow and her fallen heir had arrived. Hattie moved beside Julian with measured grace, greeting those who approached with quiet courtesy. Many did not recognize her at first. Her mask and gown gave her the illusion of nobility untouched by scandal. A few offered warm greetings, most gave polite nods. But among them lurked the sharp eyes of women who remembered everything and forgave nothing. Julian stayed close to her side, his hand lightly touching her back, guiding her, guarding her. He watched as glances turned into whispers and smiles twisted into speculation. It was during a waltz that she became separated from him. He had been drawn into conversation with a colleague, and Hattie, needing air, stepped out onto the side gallery. The night was cool. She stood alone, watching the flicker of carriage lights beyond the garden wall, her breath visible in the air. "Mrs. Barrett," came a voice behind her. She turned. It was Eloise Danforth, clad in emerald silk, her mask resting atop her coiffed curls. "I must confess," Eloise purred, "I didn't recognize you. But then again, I suppose no one ever really sees the woman behind the widow's fortune." Hattie offered a quiet smile. "Some prefer not to look." Eloise stepped closer. "There are whispers, you know, that your husband purchased his freedom with your money, that the arrangement was convenient for both of you." Hattie's spine straightened, but her voice remained calm. "There are always whispers, Miss Danforth. One must simply choose whether to listen." Eloise's smile was sharp. "One must also be prepared to answer." Before Hattie could reply, Julian appeared, his expression unreadable. "Miss Danforth," he said coolly, "I believe your companions are seeking you." Eloise faltered. "Mr. Barrett, I was merely welcoming your wife." "I'm certain she appreciates your concern," he said, offering his arm to Hattie. "But I find she doesn't need defending, only decency." Eloise hesitated, then offered a curtsy too shallow to be sincere before sweeping back into the ballroom. Julian turned to Hattie, still offering his arm. "Shall we?" She took it without hesitation. As they re-entered the ballroom, eyes followed them. The music swelled. Julian led her onto the floor, and for the first time, they danced. The steps were elegant, practiced, but what passed between them was far more than rhythm. His hand rested against the small of her back. Her gloved fingers brushed his, and their eyes locked, not in challenge, but in discovery. Around them, the world spun, lace, light and laughter, but they moved within a stillness, as if the truth had formed a quiet cocoon around them. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice barely above the music, "for everything I didn't see." Hattie did not answer at first. Then with a grace that broke his breath, she replied, "And I'm not the woman you married, not entirely." He looked at her. "No, you're far more." When the final note of the waltz faded, applause rippled through the room, but Julian heard none of it. He led her from the floor, their hands still linked, no longer for appearance, but by choice. And so the night passed, not in grand declarations, but in glances, gestures, and a silence filled not with distance, but with understanding. A fragile bridge had been built beneath the masks and music. And somewhere deep within the heart of Boston's coldest season, something warm had begun to stir. The days that followed the masquerade settled upon the Prescott household like the quiet after a long-awaited storm, not one of destruction, but of revelation. The city outside continued its rhythm of ambition and etiquette, but inside the house on Beacon Hill, something imperceptible had shifted. It was in the way the curtains were drawn slightly earlier to capture the amber light of late afternoon, in the way the silence between Hattie and Julian no longer echoed with distance, but waited, expectant, alive. Julian rose earlier now, long before the house bustled with its morning rituals. He took his breakfast in the conservatory, a modest glass extension where ferns grew in thick pots and the windows fogged gently in the cool. Hattie often passed through with a book or a letter in hand, and he began to offer her a place beside him. At first, she would decline with a soft smile, but on the third morning, she stayed. They spoke of small things, the changing weather, a new volume of poetry recently reviewed in the Gazette, the way Boston's skyline softened under fog. But even the smallest things, spoken with ease, felt like acts of courage between two people who had known only silence. One morning, as they walked the narrow path behind the house, a garden long past its bloom but still dignified in its fading, Julian glanced at Hattie and asked, "Why did you agree to marry me?" She paused, her eyes on the brittle vines clinging to the trellis. "Because the alternative was a life of being owned by whispers. At least this way, the terms were clear." He frowned. "You make it sound like it was a transaction." "It was, but not for you." She turned to him then, her gaze steady. "For me, most of all." Her honesty struck him like a stone tossed gently into water. No violence, just ripples that would not stop. Later that week, she invited him into her private study. It was a modest room with tall bookshelves, stacks of papers tied in ribbon, and a small oil painting of a harbour at dawn. The light filtered through lace curtains and fell across a large leather-bound ledger resting atop her desk. "I'd like to show you something," she said, gesturing for him to sit. She opened the ledger and turned it toward him. Row upon row of names filled the page, next to each a column of numbers and brief notes in precise handwriting. Julian leaned in, scanning them. "These are debts," he murmured. "Business obligations," she corrected softly. "Owed to my late husband, owed to me." He looked up. "From these men?" She nodded. "Tycoons, landowners, shipping families, some paid, most did not. After Edgar's death, they assumed I wouldn't pursue them, that I wouldn't dare." Julian's jaw clenched. He ran a finger along one of the names. "This man lives in Chestnut Hill. He owns 3 carriages and just rebuilt his townhouse. And he owes you $4,000. Hattie closed the ledger. "It wasn't worth the fight, not then. I had enough, and I didn't want to beg for what was already mine." He sat back, troubled. "They took advantage of you. They did what men like them do when they see a woman alone and assume her silence is weakness." He was quiet for a moment. Then, with unexpected clarity, he said, "Let me help." Hattie blinked. "You don't have to." "I know," he replied. "That's why I'm offering." Their eyes met, his filled with something he had not yet named, hers wary, but not closed. She gave a single nod, and in that gesture something unspoken passed between them. Trust, perhaps, or its first fragile thread. The days turned colder. Julian began visiting offices, reading through correspondence, writing discreet letters under Hattie's direction. Together, they crafted replies, firm, articulate, indisputable. Hattie guided him through the tone she had learned to adopt, not emotional, but dignified, not desperate but precise. In the evenings they sat by the fire in the drawing room. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't speak at all. But the space they shared no longer felt obligatory. It felt chosen. One evening Hattie stood beside the fireplace, holding a cup of chamomile. Her hair had come loose from its pins, and soft waves fell near her collar. Julian sat nearby, his gaze drawn to her in a way he could no longer deny. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She looked at him over her shoulder. "Of course. Why don't people know?" "Know what?" He rose, crossing the room slowly. "What you do, who you are, the work you've done quietly, the debts you never pressed, the girls you've helped." She lowered her gaze. "Because no one wants to hear that a woman built something quietly. They want her loud or fallen." Julian studied her for a long moment. "Then perhaps they've been looking in the wrong direction." She smiled faintly. "You sound surprised." "I am. Because I don't look the part?" "No," he said softly. Because I never gave myself permission to see you." Their gazes held. The fire crackled. The room seemed to still. Slowly he stepped toward her, stopping just a breath away. Her eyes lifted to his, and something deep within her stirred, not longing but ache. The ache of years without being touched, seen, chosen. His hand lifted, fingers brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. The touch was light, almost reverent. Her breath caught, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Julian's voice was low. "You're not what I expected." "Neither are you," she whispered. Their faces drew closer. The air between them shimmered with the weight of what might happen. The warmth of the fire, the scent of lavender, the soft glow of lamplight, it all swirled around them in fragile stillness. And then Julian hesitated. He pulled back just slightly, his eyes dark with conflict. "I'm not sure," he said quietly, "if this is me, or guilt, or gratitude." Hattie looked at him with quiet understanding, though pain flickered briefly in her eyes. "I'd rather you be unsure," she said, "than lie to yourself." Julian stepped back, nodding once, jaw tense. "Good night, Hattie." She did not stop him. She turned back to the fire, her hand closing around the cup of tea grown cold. The room was silent once more. But the silence had changed, because even withheld desire, when born of honesty, leaves a mark deeper than touch. The grey days of late November had wrapped the city of Boston in a damp chill. The streets glistened with half-melted sleet, and the gas lamps flickered beneath a low sky that never quite turned to day. Inside the Prescott townhouse, the warmth of the hearth could not fully chase away the cold that had begun to gather not in the walls, but in the hearts of those who lived within them. Julian Barrett stood by the parlour window, watching the carriages pass in silence. His fingers, clasped behind his back, twitched with a restlessness he could neither explain nor ignore. His thoughts were as heavy as the clouds overhead, tangled with questions he did not know how to voice. It had begun so subtly, a shift in the way he spoke to Hattie, in the way he listened when she entered a room, in the way his gaze lingered on her as if waiting for something unnamed to rise between them. But with each day that passed, that closeness had drawn notice, and not all of it welcome. A week earlier, a letter had arrived at Greystone Hall. The seal was familiar, deep green wax bearing the louring crest. It was delivered not to Julian, but to Thaddeus. And that morning, Julian had been summoned. Greystone, though once grand, now felt like the carcass of a lion, proud and decayed. The walls were lined with old portraits of dead men in powdered wigs, men whose names had built legacies with sharp deals and sharper silences. Julian entered his stepfather's study and found him seated behind a large desk of dark oak, a glass of port untouched at his elbow. "You've been busy," Thaddeus said, not looking up. Julian raised a brow. "Managing ledgers, reviewing contracts. Is that now considered dangerous behavior?" Thaddeus leaned back in his chair and met Julian's gaze. "Don't play coy. You've been parading around town with that woman as if she were your equal." Julian stiffened. "She is my wife." "She's a widow," Thaddeus hissed, "with a fortune built on convenience and manipulation. You've been charmed by lace and pity, but you're still a Barrett, and a Barrett does not bow to a Prescott." The silence that followed burned. Julian stepped forward. "You're wrong. You've always been wrong about her." Thaddeus stood then, eyes sharp. "I know more about Hattie than you do. And I have proof, legal proof, that would make her fortune no longer hers." Julian's voice dropped. "What are you saying?" Thaddeus poured a second glass of port but did not drink. "Let's say certain documents weren't filed as they should have been after Edgar Prescott's death. Let's say some transfers of property could be challenged, if someone were inclined." "Why haven't you?" Thaddeus smiled coldly. "Because I had no reason. Until now." Julian's fists clenched. "If you do anything to harm her—" "Harm?" Thaddeus laughed. "This isn't personal, Julian. This is legacy. You think you're falling in love with a woman? You're falling into her trap. Don't be ruled by her softness. It's a mask. And when it slips, you'll find exactly what I've known all along." Julian left without a word, the fury rising in his chest like a wave. Back on Beacon Hill, the townhouse greeted him with its familiar stillness. But for the first time, he feared what might be hiding beneath that silence. He passed Hattie in the corridor. She smiled, soft and fleeting, and he kissed her hand. Yet even then, his thoughts were no longer still. That night, over dinner, she sensed it. The way he looked at her, not with suspicion, not with disdain, but with something more dangerous. Doubt. "Something's troubling you," she said gently as she poured him tea. Julian looked at her, searching her face. "Have you ever lied to me?" The teacup paused mid-air. She met his gaze evenly, not knowingly. He nodded, but the silence that followed felt unfinished. 3 days later, the doorbell rang as dusk fell across the house. Mrs. Higgins opened it with a frown and ushered in a man who had not been expected, nor welcomed. Mr. Lucian Armitage, once a close friend of Edgar Prescott, stepped into the foyer in a coat of sable wool, with a cane tipped in ivory and a smirk that never reached his eyes. Hattie descended the stairs slowly, her face pale. "Lucian," she said, her voice clipped, "I wasn't aware you were in Boston." "I make it a point to be where opportunity lies," he replied smoothly. "May I speak with you? Alone?" She hesitated, then nodded. Julian, watching from the end of the corridor, narrowed his gaze and followed the sound of their voices to the sitting room. The conversation was quiet, but not quiet enough. "I've come into possession of certain documents," Lucian was saying, "regarding your late husband's estate. They suggest some inconsistencies, potentially damaging ones." "I see," Hattie replied, her voice like steel wrapped in velvet. "And what do you want?" Lucian smiled. "Only what I've always wanted, a seat at your table." Hattie's eyes darkened. "You made your intentions clear once. I declined then. My answer has not changed." "You might regret that," he whispered. "Sooner than you think." Julian stepped forward. "That's enough." Lucian turned. "Mr. Barrett, I was just leaving." He tipped his hat mockingly and exited the house without another word. Once the door had shut behind him, Julian turned to Hattie. "Who was he to you?" She didn't flinch. "A suitor. Years ago. Persistent. Unkind." "Did you have business with him?" "No. Edgar did. I ended it after his death." Julian took a step closer. "Did he know about the ledgers?" Her silence was brief. Too brief. "I don't know," she said. And in that moment, something in Julian cracked. "You should have told me," he said, voice low, trembling. "I didn't think—" "No, Hattie, you chose not to think. About what it would mean if someone like him came forward. About what I'm trying to protect." She stared at him, stunned. "Protect or control?" He stepped back, as if struck. "You think this is about control?" "I think," she said, her voice breaking, "that you don't know what you think. And I'm tired of paying the price for every man who's made you doubt your own instincts." Julian looked at her, truly looked, and for the first time, he didn't see the woman he had once judged. He saw someone wounded, strong, and now bracing for abandonment. Again. And that was what shattered him. "I need time," he said. She nodded slowly, fighting the tears rising in her throat. "Then take it. But not here." Julian opened his mouth to speak, but she raised a hand. "I've lived too long with betrayal, Julian. If you're going to doubt me, do it from somewhere else." The silence that followed was suffocating. He walked to the door, hesitated, then left, the echo of his steps a wound against the polished floor. Upstairs, alone, Hattie collapsed into a chair by the window, her breath uneven. Outside, the storm clouds gathered, and within her the old ache returned, the ache of being loved almost, and always left behind. The city lay cloaked in winter's breath, each rooftop brushed in frost, each window pane fogged with condensation that blurred the world outside. The gas lamps along Beacon Street burned pale in the early dusk, casting long shadows over cobblestones slick with sleet. Inside a study not far from the harbour, Julian Barrett turned the final page of a document that had no right to exist, and felt his world collapse beneath the weight of its truth. The room smelled of old parchment and betrayal. Before him, the ledger sat open, its signatures false, its dates forged. The ink had faded in places, but the deception was unmistakable, and the name at the bottom, written in the same angular scrawl he had seen since boyhood, confirmed what he already feared: Thaddeus Loring. Julian's chest rose and fell in silence as he leaned back in the creaking leather chair. For days, he had buried himself in the archives of the family firm, scouring contracts, correspondence, and inheritance filings after his mother's death. What had begun as a search for clarity had become an excavation of lies, of omissions, of choices made in darkness. And now, the final piece stood before him in cold ink. Thaddeus had stolen from Hattie, not once, but with cruel precision. The investments Lydia Barrett had quietly set aside, funds meant for a trust in Hattie's name, had been intercepted, rerouted, and declared unclaimed by Thaddeus within weeks of Lydia's passing. And worse, Julian had found letters, clipped and half-burned in an old tin box, from Lydia to a legal advisor. Letters in which she had expressed her intention to transfer those assets to Hattie, a final act of atonement for the silence she had kept during the scandal that had once shattered Hattie's name. But those letters had never reached their destination. Julian closed the tin slowly, unable to move for several minutes. His blood thundered in his ears, and he could barely breathe. Each breath was thick with guilt, thick with the echo of his own words, his own blindness. He had stood at Hattie's side and doubted her. He had let another man's sins define her in his eyes. Outside, the wind howled against the shutters. A storm had risen in the city, and within Julian, another. That evening, he returned to the house on Beacon Hill. The door opened before he knocked, as if the house itself recognized its master. Mrs. Higgins stood in the hallway, her expression hard. "She's not receiving," the housekeeper said coldly, arms folded across her chest. Julian stepped inside, his voice low. "I'm not here to be received. I'm here to confess." Mrs. Higgins studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside. "She's in the morning room, but don't expect warmth." The air inside was cool, despite the fire crackling in the grate. Hattie stood by the tall window, her figure outlined against the night. She wore a dark burgundy gown, severe in its simplicity, her hair pinned in a low knot. She did not turn when he entered. Julian closed the door behind him and removed his gloves slowly. "I know the truth," he said. She remained silent. "I found the forged papers, the diverted funds, the letters my mother wrote, the ones Thaddeus burned." At this she turned, her eyes clear but unreadable. "I found proof," he said, "that Thaddeus orchestrated the scandal, that he let your name rot in society's mouth while he profited from your ruin." Her lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Julian took a step closer. "And I believed him. I let him feed me doubts, and I drank them because it was easier than facing the truth, that you were never the villain in this story, that I was." Hattie's voice was calm, but cold. "What do you want me to say, Julian? That I forgive you? That it's enough now that you finally see?" He looked down, ashamed. "I want nothing from you, only that you hear me say it." She stepped forward, just enough that he could see the faint sheen in her eyes. "I waited years for someone to believe me. Years, Julian. I lost friendships, invitations, respect, all while I smiled and survived and told myself that silence was strength. I know." "No," she said, voice rising. "You don't. You can't. You stood in rooms where my name was dragged through ash, and you never once asked why." Julian's shoulders fell. "I was a coward." "Yes," she whispered. The room trembled with what was not said. Julian moved closer still. "But I don't want to be. Not anymore. I want to make this right, as much as it can be made right." Hattie looked at him for a long moment, and then, with trembling breath, she said, "There are wounds that don't close with apology." He nodded. "Then let me be part of your armor, or your silence, or your war. Whatever you need." She turned back to the window. "I don't know what I need." He stood behind her, not touching, only close enough for her to feel his presence. "I'll wait," he said quietly, "as long as it takes." But she said nothing more. That night, after he had gone, Hattie wrapped herself in a wool shawl and stepped out into the frozen streets. The snow had begun to fall, soft and silent, dusting the steps of the chapel near Tremont Street. She moved without haste, her breath forming clouds in the dark. When she reached the iron gate of the cemetery, she pushed it open with both hands and walked past the rows of headstones until she found the one she sought. Lydia Whitmore Barrett. She knelt before the grave and removed a letter from her coat pocket, the same letter she had read countless times. The final one, unsigned, left in the pages of a book that had arrived without warning after Lydia's death. "I don't know if you ever meant for me to read it," Hattie said aloud, "but I did." She unfolded the paper and read it softly under her breath, the snow landing in her hair and on her gloves. "I was a coward, Hattie. I let him use my name, my silence. I let him tell the world you were less than you are. I never believed it. I just wasn't brave enough to say so." She looked up at the sky, the flakes dissolving on her lashes. "I forgave you long ago," she whispered, "but I've never forgiven myself. For letting your absence define me, for letting fear be louder than love." She stood slowly. "Now I fight," she said, "not to punish, but to reclaim." And with that she turned and walked away, the snow falling heavier now, erasing the footprints behind her. Back at the townhouse, she entered the library alone. She opened the ledger, lit a fresh candle, and began to write letters, not of grief, but of fire. She would not remain silent, not anymore. The snow had not stopped since dawn. It fell in hushed sheets over Boston, blanketing rooftops, muffling footsteps, and turning the city's relentless pace into something slower, something ceremonial. Gas lamps flickered beneath icicles, and the streets were nearly empty, save for the occasional carriage-carving paths through slush and silence. But in the heart of the financial district, behind the frost-glazed windows of the Chamber of Commerce, something else was stirring. A reckoning. Inside, the great hall was warm but tense. A fire roared in the corner hearth, but no one paid it mind. At the front of the room, 12 men sat behind a long carved table, Boston's most powerful investors, industrialists, and legal overseers. Some wore spectacles, others had silver mustaches and waistcoats that stretched too tight. All wore expressions shaped by years of entitlement, caution, and unspoken alliances. And into that room, Hattie Prescott Barrett walked, gloved hands steady, spine straight, gaze unflinching. She wore a fitted gown of deep navy wool trimmed with black velvet, her hair drawn into a low chignon, her presence composed, poised, and unshakable. Snowflakes clung to the hem of her cloak as Julian Barrett walked just behind her, tall and solemn in his dark coat, every line of his face carved with resolve. Whispers rippled through the room like wind through tall grass. She had come, the widow, the wife, the woman who had once been ruined and erased. At the center of the panel sat Mr. Alden Sedgwick, a man whose name opened doors and whose silence closed them. He adjusted his glasses as he leaned forward. "Mrs. Barrett, we understand you have something significant to present." Hattie removed her gloves with slow precision and passed a bound file across the table. "Yes, evidence of property fraud, willful misrepresentation of inheritance, and obstruction of legal transfers, all orchestrated by Mr. Thaddeus Loring over a period of 7 years. A murmur, a cough. Sedgwick's brow furrowed. "And you have proof?" "I do." She gestured to Julian, who stepped forward with a smaller stack of letters, contracts, and receipts. most of them bearing signatures now confirmed as forged. For the next several minutes, Hattie spoke, not with theatrics, not with emotion, but with clarity, detail, and the quiet authority of a woman who had waited too long to be heard. She laid out the timeline, the diverted funds, the altered names, the payments intercepted, the letters from Lydia Barrett that had never reached her. Every page she placed before the panel was a nail in the coffin of Thaddeus's carefully constructed image. When she finished, she stood in silence. It was then that the door opened, and Thaddeus Loring entered, late, as if summoned by arrogance rather than duty. His cane tapped rhythmically against the marble floor as he approached, wrapped in a fine grey overcoat and gloves lined with fur. His gaze swept the room with feigned calm before landing on Hattie. "Well," he said, voice smooth as oil, "this is quite the performance." Julian's jaw tightened, but Hattie held up a hand. "This is not a performance, Mr. Loring. This is an accounting." One of the panelists, a stern-faced banker named Drayton, gestured toward the evidence. "These are serious accusations," he said, "and the documents speak loudly. Do you deny their validity?" Thaddeus laughed once. "I deny nothing until I see them reviewed by an actual court." "You will," Hattie replied, "but first you'll answer to the men whose investments you misused, the families you deceived, and the name you trampled to do it." There was silence, thick and waiting. Then Sedgwick leaned forward. "We will request an audit, but based on what we see here, Mrs. Barrett's claims appear more than credible. In light of this, we will be issuing a full public statement acknowledging the breach. You, Mr. Loring, will step down from your position in the commercial committee, effective immediately." The air shifted. "And Mrs. Barrett," Sedgwick added, turning to her with the smallest nod of respect, "your name will be formally cleared in the committee records, as it should have been years ago." Thaddeus turned to Julian then, fury barely concealed. "You bring shame to your blood." Julian met his gaze with perfect stillness. "You brought shame to everything that bore your name. I'm just uncovering it." With that, Thaddeus turned and left, the echo of his cane now sounding like defeat. Moments later, the doors opened again, not for scandal this time, but for history. As Hattie and Julian stepped outside, the snow fell heavier, blanketing the steps in white. Carriages slowed to watch them descend, and onlookers peered from corners and shop windows, recognizing the woman they had once whispered about. But now, their silence held no malice, only awe. They reached the foot of the steps, and there, beneath the grey sky and swirling snow, Julian stopped her. "You did it," he said, voice raw. "No," she replied, her voice softer than the falling snow. "We did." He took her gloved hands in his. "For years," he said slowly, "I let other people's words become my truth. I doubted you. I stood beside you and still failed to see you. But today, I am proud to call you not just my wife, but the woman who taught me what strength truly is." Hattie stared at him, her heart thundering. His fingers brushed her cheek. "You saved me from myself." And there, in the middle of the square, in full view of the city that had once scorned her, he kissed her, not with ceremony, but with devotion. The kiss was tender, reverent, slow. It was not the kiss of a man claiming, but of one offering everything he was, everything he had learned to become. The snow continued to fall, soft and soundless, and the world around them blurred into silence. They remained like that for a long moment, suspended in a stillness that neither frost nor time could break. And when they finally pulled apart, the look in Hattie's eyes was not one of triumph, but of peace. Earned, deserved. They walked on, hand in hand, leaving behind footprints that the snow would soon cover, but not the world, not the hearts that had watched, not the truth they had reclaimed, together. The frost had receded from the cobblestones of Beacon Hill, and with it, the chill that had once lingered between two hearts, learning how to beat as one. The city stirred gently beneath the early whispers of spring. Window panes breathed condensation with each new dawn, and crocuses bloomed defiantly between the cracks of old brick courtyards. The season was not yet in full blossom, but in the Prescott home, something more enduring than spring had taken root. It had been 3 months since the scandal broke, and Thaddeus Loring's name had vanished from the society pages. 3 months since Hattie Prescott stood before men who had once ridiculed her and left them silent beneath the weight of her truth. And 3 months since Julian Barrett had knelt not before a courtroom, but before his own remorse. In that time, they had not chased grandeur. Their townhouse on Beacon Street remained modest by Boston standards, a relic of old respectability with its ivy-covered stonework and sun-warmed window bays. But it had become a different kind of haven. Not a trophy of survival, but a place of gathering, of restoration. Their parlour, once hushed and formal, now echoed with lively conversation, the rustle of newspaper sketches and the hum of youthful laughter. Teachers, painters, aspiring writers and seamstresses, once cast aside by polite society, found their way through Hattie's polished oak doors. Julian, ever quiet in company, would observe from his corner chair, a soft smile in place as he watched Hattie move between guests like a candle-lit hostess, her warmth subtle but ever-present. In the mornings, before guests arrived and before the house filled with voices, Hattie worked alone. She sat in the east-facing study, the smallest room in the house, where a wide desk overlooked the rooftops and the harbour beyond. There, she reviewed letters from factory owners, arranged stipends for girls too young to fight for themselves, and wrote meticulous notes on ledgers once abandoned in the wake of her husband's death. She still wore widow's colours in public, though her gowns had softened with time, hues of dove grey and pale violet, replacing the stark black that once shielded her. Julian had taken to rising early too. At first, it had been out of habit, the remnant of years spent performing for a world that had since cast him out. But now, it was different. He woke not from duty, but from quiet anticipation, drawn by the sound of Hattie's footsteps down the stairs or the aroma of chicory coffee brewing in the kitchen. He had taken the carriage less often, choosing instead to walk through the bustling streets to a small brick school he had helped open in the South End. The school welcomed working-class boys, sons of porters, tradesmen, even former mill hands. There Julian taught history and mathematics, though it was his weekly lectures on moral courage that left the greatest impression. Though their lives ran on parallel rails of reform, Hattie and Julian shared space now with ease. They dined together, sometimes in silence, sometimes in quiet conversation, and they read by the same hearth, no longer seated apart. Yet still, a fragile boundary remained, not of mistrust, but of caution. Neither spoke of love. Neither had uttered the words that once felt like shackles on their wedding day. But in the space between them, something unspoken had begun to bloom. It was on one such morning, with the first light of March sifting gently through the muslin curtains, that Julian came down the staircase and paused in the archway to the parlour. There she was. Hattie stood by the window, facing the garden that still lay bare beneath the thaw. She wore a soft morning gown of pale blue wool, cinched delicately at the waist with a ribbon of cream. Her hair, now slightly longer than when they first wed, was gathered loosely at her nape, with a few strands lit gold by the rising sun. She was humming, not loudly, but just enough for the melody to warm the quiet like steam from a teacup. Her fingers absent-mindedly traced the window frame, and her lips curved into the faintest smile as she watched 2 sparrows peck near the hedges. Julian did not speak. He stood frozen, struck not by surprise but by recognition, the kind that sneaks in slowly, like warmth returning to numb fingers. It wasn't just that she was beautiful, though she was, in a way that defied fashion and defied time. It was the way her presence filled the room, the peace she carried with her, the courage she wore not like a badge, but like a thread woven through her every gesture. And he loved her. He had loved her quietly for weeks, perhaps longer. In the curve of her laugh when she read aloud from a letter, in the soft way she touched a child's shoulder at the school, in the endless patience with which she had endured his arrogance, his distance, his doubts. He stepped forward. The floor creaked softly beneath his feet, and Hattie turned. "Oh," she said, her tone gentle. "You're up early." "I didn't want to miss the morning," he replied, almost breathless. "And I didn't want to miss you." Her brows lifted slightly, her lips parting just enough to invite a question she could not yet voice. He reached into his coat pocket and retrieved a small box wrapped in ivory paper. Without ceremony, he offered it to her. "For you," he said. "No occasion, just today." Hattie hesitated, then took it. Her fingers unwrapped the box carefully, lifting the lid to reveal a silver locket, gleaming softly in the light. The front was engraved with her initials, HP, in delicate script. Inside, 2 compartments waited. One side held a miniature portrait of the Beacon Hill house, painted in delicate watercolor strokes. The other, still empty. Julian cleared his throat. "I thought you might place something there. Something that matters to you." She looked up at him, eyes brimming with a tenderness so quiet it nearly broke him. "I thought," he continued, voice low, "that perhaps this time I could ask you to marry me again, not out of obligation or pity or duty, but because I cannot imagine this home or this life without you in it," he faltered, breath catching. "As my partner, my wife, my heart." Hattie said nothing at first. She looked down at the locket again, then out the window. A soft breeze stirred the curtain hem. In the garden, the sparrows had taken flight. She closed the locket, clasped it to her chest, and met his gaze. "You already have my heart, Julian," she said, her voice steady. "You just needed to ask for it." No music played, no crowd bore witness. But in that room, with the city stretching awake beyond the panes, 2 souls stepped fully into the light. And outside, though the trees were still bare and the earth still damp, spring had begun, at last. The morning broke gently over Beacon Hill, casting long golden rays across the slanted rooftops and dew-speckled gardens. It was the first true day of spring, and the city, though not yet loud with summer clamour, seemed to breathe with new life. From the bakeries came the scent of fresh loaves, from the harbour the soft hum of distant sails, and in the Prescott townhouse, nestled beneath ivy-covered stone and dignified shutters, a quiet celebration was unfolding. It had been 1 year to the day since Hattie and Julian had stood in that same parlour, strangers, husband and wife only in name. Much had changed since then. The distance that once separated them had dissolved, not with grand gestures, but with small, steady kindnesses. Trust had been earned, not given. And love, real love, had blossomed in the soil of hardship, forgiveness, and shared purpose. Upstairs, Julian sat at the antique writing desk in their bedroom, dressed in a crisp waistcoat of charcoal grey, his dark blonde hair brushed back, but a little unruly near the temples. Before him lay a single sheet of linen paper, his fountain pen poised between thoughtful fingers. He had rewritten the note twice already, but the words still pressed against his chest, heavy, unspoken. He glanced toward the window, where he could hear the bustle of preparations below, the faint clink of porcelain, the laughter of young women arriving in pairs, their voices filled with memories and hope. Hattie had planned this gathering for weeks. It would be no ball, no grand affair adorned with crystal or chandeliers. It would be something finer, a reunion, a homecoming, a declaration that healing was not only possible, it was happening. With a quiet sigh, Julian dipped his pen once more and began to write. Hattie, this morning I rose before the sun and found myself staring at your empty side of the bed, not in longing, but in reverence. You were never plain. You were never ordinary. You were always the gift I never expected. Your strength softened me. Your grace humbled me. And your love, unspoken though it was for so long, has rebuilt the man I thought I had lost. Today is our anniversary, not of the day we married, but of the day I truly became your husband. And so, I give you this letter, not to replace the ones you once read in silence, but to stand beside them, not to ask, but to thank, not to promise, but to honor. With all that I am, Julian. He folded the page carefully, slid it into an envelope embossed with her name in silver, and sealed it with a wax stamp, the same seal that once belonged to his mother. With a steady breath, he rose and made his way downstairs. The parlour had been transformed, gone were the muted shadows of the early months. The curtains had been drawn wide, letting in a cascade of morning light that danced across the polished floors. Vases of spring blossoms, daffodils, lilacs and white tulips adorned every table, and everywhere there was laughter. Women stood in clusters, embracing, exchanging stories. These were the same girls Hattie had once taught to read by candlelight in a sewing room. Now they arrived in fine bonnets and tailored gloves, bearing their own calling cards. Some owned millineries, others had opened small printing shops or worked as schoolteachers in distant towns. They greeted Hattie with a reverence that no society page could capture. Julian stepped into the room quietly, unnoticed for a moment, and simply watched. Hattie moved among them with the grace of a woman who had stopped trying to prove herself. Her gown was of soft ivory muslin with delicate lavender embroidery at the hem, and a brooch in the shape of a lily adorned her collar. Her dark auburn hair was swept into a braided twist, with wisps curling around her cheeks as she laughed, clasped hands, and welcomed each guest like a sister returned. He approached only when the moment allowed. Hattie turned, her smile softening when she saw the envelope in his hand. "For me?" she asked quietly. "For you," he said, voice low and steady. She did not open it there. Instead, she held it to her chest, nodding once, not in surprise, but in understanding. Later, when the guests moved to the garden for refreshments and chatter, Hattie slipped away to her study. There, in the quiet sanctuary of books, sunlight, and the scent of lavender oil, she sat at her writing desk. She opened the letter slowly, her fingers trembling only slightly. As her eyes traced the words, her breath caught. Tears welled, not from sorrow, but from a fullness too vast to name. She reached for her journal, the one where she had once tucked away Lydia Barrett's final letter, and placed Julian's note gently beside it. 2 letters, 2 voices, one past laid to rest and one future just beginning. Outside, laughter echoed, and Hattie returned to it, cheeks flushed, steps lighter. The rest of the afternoon unfolded like a painting in motion. Conversations swelled and softened. A piano tune floated from the open parlour. Tea was poured and lemon cakes passed. Julian stood beside Hattie as she gave a brief speech, her words simple but stirring, a celebration of resilience, of reclaimed dignity, of community forged in silence and defiance. As the sun dipped low behind the rooftops, casting everything in a golden glow, the guests took their leave one by one, promises made to return, to write, to continue what had begun in the small sewing room of a grieving widow. Dusk settled, cool and fragrant. The garden lanterns flickered to life, and in the quiet that followed, Julian reached for Hattie's hand. "Walk with me," he asked. She nodded. They left the townhouse arm in arm, strolling down the cobbled path that led to the street. Beacon Hill stretched before them, familiar and changed. The gas lamps glowed like stars fallen to earth. Children's laughter echoed in the distance. A carriage rolled past, slow and respectful. They did not speak at first. Words were no longer needed. Every step was a vow. Every glance a history rewritten. As they reached the crest of the hill, the sun finally dipped beyond the skyline, leaving a final burst of amber against the horizon. Hattie paused, gazing out across the rooftops, and Julian turned toward her, his hand never letting go. And then came the final words, not spoken aloud, but carried in the air like the scent of lilac on the breeze. Love does not always come when we are young. Sometimes it arrives when we are finally ready to receive it. Their silhouettes lingered in the golden light, framed by the city that had once judged them and now bore witness to their quiet triumph. And in that final moment, nothing more was needed. Boston, spring of 1905. The house on Beacon Hill stood much as it always had, its brick facade softened by ivy, its windows glowing warmly with the amber light of early evening. But the street had changed. Where once horse-drawn carriages ruled the road, now an occasional motor car hummed by, drawing curious glances from children and disapproving ones from the elderly. Women walked with more confidence, hats tilted over determined brows. And in the soft air of April, the city itself seemed to breathe differently, freer, wiser, gentler. Inside, the Prescott Barrett home was quiet for the first time all day. The final guests had departed an hour ago. Former students, reformers, and friends of many causes all gathered to celebrate a remarkable milestone, the 10th anniversary of the Hattie Prescott Foundation for Girls' Education and Civic Advancement. In the parlor, bouquets of wildflowers sat in crystal vases. Empty teacups waited to be cleared. And beside the window, Julian Barrett sat in a carved walnut chair, spectacles perched low on his nose, reading aloud from a dog-eared book of poetry. Across from him, in an armchair embroidered with violets, Hattie Prescott Barrett listened with closed eyes and a gentle smile. Her hair, now streaked with silver, was still drawn back in the same elegant twist. She wore a gown of soft grey silk, her wedding locket still nestled at her throat. The years had only deepened her grace, and her quiet defiance of everything society once said she could never be. Julian paused, glancing over the top of the book. "She's asleep," came a voice from the doorway. It was Edward, their son, 8 years old, mischievous-eyed, with Julian's blonde waves and Hattie's thoughtful gaze. He tiptoed into the room, holding a folded paper behind his back. Julian grinned. "She's pretending." "I am not," Hattie replied without opening her eyes, and Edward giggled. She reached out her hand, and he placed the folded paper in it. A drawing of their house with the words, "My mother is a hero," written in a scrawl of crooked letters. Her eyes welled instantly. Julian rose and sat beside her, pulling both of them into his arms. "You are, you know," he whispered. "You changed more lives than anyone will ever count." She leaned into him. Not alone. The silence that followed was full, not empty. 11 years had passed, and still the ache of their beginnings sometimes stirred. The memory of that first cold wedding night, the sting of society's cruelty, the slow unlearning of pride and pain. But time had not dulled their love. It had deepened it, weathered it, made it real in ways youthful passion could never reach. They had one child, their miracle, born after a decade of believing such joy might not come. Edward had arrived on a stormy night in May, red-faced and furious, and ever since their lives had been fuller, louder, messier, and endlessly grateful. The world had changed too. The factory girls Hattie once taught had become women of influence. One now ran a printing press in Brooklyn. Another was the first female teacher at a Boston preparatory school. And more than one had written to say, "I would have never dared to dream, if not for you." Thaddeus Loring, disgraced and exiled from polite society, had spent his final years in a coastal estate, isolated and bitter. He never apologized. He never returned. But his absence had become its own kind of justice. The letters, those precious confessions from Lydia Barrett, remained locked in Hattie's drawer, beside Julian's first love letter, now faded at the edges, but never forgotten. Each year on their anniversary, they reread both, not for sorrow, but to remember, to honor the road that led them here. A clock chimed softly in the distance. Evening had arrived. Edward bounded off, shouting that he would name all his children after poets. "Or pirates, I haven't decided." And Hattie laughed until tears blurred her vision. Julian watched her. "You still take my breath," he said. She turned to him. "And you still carry my heart." They stood together at the window, hands entwined, watching the city shimmer in the fading light. Below, lamplighters moved down the street. A young couple passed by, arm in arm, whispering dreams. A girl in a newsboy cap tossed a newspaper onto their steps. The front page headline read, "Women's Scholarship Bill Advances, Inspired by Local Educators' Legacy." The world had not always been kind, but in the end, love had endured. Not just between them, but through the hundreds of lives their union had quietly shaped. As twilight deepened and the first stars blinked awake, Hattie rested her head on Julian's shoulder. "I never thought life would bring me here," she whispered. Julian kissed her hair. "Life didn't bring us here," he replied. "We walked. Together." And the past, with all its wounds, faded softly into memory, as two souls who had once begun in silence now stood surrounded by the echo of every word they dared to say, every step they had chosen to take, side by side, forever. Some stories whisper their power, not with grand declarations, but with quiet strength, like a letter never sent, a hand finally held, a love that blooms long after winter. Hattie and Julian's journey reminds us that love doesn't always arrive in youth. With fire and roses, sometimes it comes softly after heartbreak, when we least expect it, but most need it. It teaches us that true partnership is built not on appearances, but on courage, grace, and second chances. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to know. Please share your thoughts in the comments, and if you made it all the way here, write the word "locket" below. That way, I'll know you were with Hattie until the very last page. Don't forget to share this story with a friend, a sister, or someone who still believes in love that heals. And if you're new here, I invite you to explore the other historical romances I've linked in the cards. Tales of women who defied their time and men who learned to love them for it. Thank you for joining me. And remember, love doesn't ask when. It simply arrives when we're finally ready to receive it.